Hello. Welcome, folks. It is November 29th. Happy belated Turkey Day. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend and break. I am Matthew, and this is Policy War. I'm, of course, the middle-of-the-road libertarian slant of a view, and I'm going to be hosting today's episode, and along with me are the other co-hosts here.
My name is Russell. I give the progressive perspective usually on this podcast.
And I am John. I offer the conservative angle.
Right on. So for today's episode, we're in for a bit of fun here. We're going to be looking at a hot topic in the news lately. Over this past month, Oregon became the first state in the union to decriminalize all drugs. Now, of course, decriminalization is not the same as legalization that may be happening in other states, like marijuana legalization. For this bill, which was passed in early November and will go into effect February 1st, Oregon will turn possession of small amounts of drugs. We're talking about upwards of a couple grams, 1 to 2 grams of most drugs, into a violation akin to a traffic ticket instead of a infraction of the law that is punishable with jail time. So, of course, this is the first time a state has ever done anything this bold in drug policy. Of course, the idea is to decrease the incarceration rate associated with those who are caught with possession of drugs that may not be dealing. And, of course, this is nothing new in the world. This is something that's been done before in Portugal and other countries as well. So on that note, I'm going to kick it to Russell, who has information on Portugal, which is one of the most successful models of drug decriminalization in the world.
All right, so thanks for the great endorsements of Portugal. I swear they've never been that recognized in their entire history. But I apologize if we have Portuguese listeners here. I'm glad you speak English also. Wow, I sound patriotic. All right, so starting with the episode, I do want to get a little bit into how America basically has moved more towards drug legalization and drug decriminalization moving to Portugal. So, just in the 2020 election, cannabis was legalized in South Dakota, Montana, New Jersey, Arizona, and obviously legal in California and many other states for recreational marijuana. And that's a prescriptor of America in the future, which I believe it will eventually decriminalize drugs and legalize marijuana in all 50 states, um, even eventually the most conservative ones. So if we see what full decriminalization looks like, we can look at Portugal, which was the first state to do it in 2001, in which they basically decriminalized all drugs, including heroin, cocaine, marijuana. Hallucinogens were not included in this, but most of the most popular illegal substances were. And what we saw in Portugal at 2001 was that they had a decrease in overall drug usage, especially among 15 to 24-year-olds, which is the main demographic for people that use illicit drugs. Also, they saw a decrease in the HIV rates from people who, say, use the same needles for drugs. There was a decreasing of that. And just before they enacted this law, they had a spike in drug usage cases. So it shows that this legislation did have a pretty big effect on people not using drugs as much. More so because it was treated as a rehabilitative issue rather than a criminal issue. If you were caught with possessing drugs that was under the criminal offense amount, then it was voluntary for you to enter drug treatment. They did not force you to enter drug treatment. So I think that's a good part, a part the American system could include, because if you force somebody to enter rehabilitation and they don't care for it, chances are it's not going to be that effective. So I think the Portuguese model is a good precursor to what America should do. I don't really believe we should decriminalize all drugs. Some drugs are still too dangerous, but the less dangerous ones, I think, should be decriminalized. If you look at how much money the U.S. is spending on average on the war on drugs since 1971, they have spent an estimated $1 trillion on the war on drugs. In 2015, it's estimated the federal government spent an average of $9 million every day to incarcerate people charged with drug related offenses. And I have more statistics I could bring up. But just to give you an idea of how much of a burden it is on the American economy and American populace to enforce such strict drug laws, perhaps decriminalization could lead to betterment of the country.
Okay, so I guess one question here, a few questions before we get to the other case that John will bring up. Where would you draw the line on the drug legalization?
I'm going to be honest, I'm not an expert on the lethality of all drugs here. I would say methamphetamines, perhaps cocaine. Definitely methamphetamines though, because it's so dangerous. And I believe we shouldn't decriminalize all of them at the same time, rather do it at a slow rate for each substance rather than each one at the same time. But that's just my opinion, kind of a hesitancy, because I know right when they legalize methamphetamines, the demand for methamphetamines will probably spike for a small amount of time, and then the news will talk about, oh, look at all these people that are dying from drugs. It was failed legislation. It's failed. We have to ban them all again. Let's repeat what we've been doing for the past 50 years since 1971, and it obviously hasn't worked. So I think decriminalization is the way to go, but not fully.
Do you have any questions, John?
I don't necessarily have questions. I just think there are a significant number of unknown factors that go into laws such as these, and I know Russell will truly hate me for bringing up this point. We also have to remember that the United States is, in fact, not a part of Portugal, and so we have to be cognizant of, even if their particular model or their particular results have been favorable, we need to make sure that we are tailoring whatever policies or laws we are creating towards the United States, or rather the individual states that pass these laws, rather than trying to copy the models or results from other countries, because I don't think we'll perfectly transplant.
I mean, just a small response. Yes, I don't believe the United States is part of Portugal. I do believe this is true. It's been a while since I looked at a map. But I think that's true. Portugal owns Spain, right? That's it, right? I'm joking, everybody. I know Portugal doesn't own Spain. I know Portugal isn't part of the United States. I swear. Okay, so we should look at these models for examples on how to implement our policy. So just because Medicare and Medicaid, for example, that was implemented in European countries way before America. But just because it's a different nation doesn't mean we can't use it as an example or a look at to how it might happen in our nation. We don't just ignore other countries.
Okay. So I guess we'll go ahead and let John bring up his case for how this will impact federalism. And then we'll get to some key questions with the overall topic itself and a possible policy like this.
This actually relates very well to the point that Russell and I just talked about, how systems from other countries aren't necessarily directly transplantable here to the United States. We have a smaller version of that happens here among the states. One of the virtues of the federal system that we have is that individual states can be laboratories for innovation. They can decide to adopt certain policies or pursue certain objectives, and from there they can even show a proof of concept for those policies and objectives, or they can show that it's not actually a great idea and other states do not have to suffer. So this entire point is going to somewhat ignore the policy argument regarding the decriminalization of drugs, even though that's an important argument for us to have, and I'm sure we will get into that. However, purely as a question of how the law will be implemented and what impacts it has on the federal system, I believe that this is a good showing of people, showing to people so that they understand why we have the ability for states to make laws such as this. Because if you just had the federal government able to regulate all drugs and all of their laws that they make were directly applicable to the states, they can commandeer state resources to enforce them, then I mean, you had a Republican administration these last 4 years. Legalization of marijuana would never have flown anywhere, and certainly this law would never get off the ground. But because we allow for states to write their own laws, to decide how they're going to enforce those laws, then they can be laboratories of innovation. And if the Oregon law goes very well and drug use rates drop, or number of overdoses, or all other manner of particular positive results come from this law, then perhaps other states will see that and follow suit. Maybe we'll see similar laws in California, in Washington. And if it goes very, very well, we could even see this expanding into red states where you wouldn't assume that drug decriminalization would have any real foothold. However, if this law doesn't work all that well, if we see drug usage rates rise, the state has to put more money into enforcing drug laws that are still on the books, or we see any number of negative results, then what this is it proves to the other states that, hey, we should back off from this, or at the very, very least, we shouldn't do it in the way that Oregon has done it, because this state is suffering from it, and our state shouldn't have to suffer if we already have a proof of concept that it doesn't work. So the implications for federalism are generally good, in that this is exactly what the system was designed for. If a state wants to pursue something, they can, and it doesn't have to be controlling upon the other states. And if it goes well, the state's going to follow suit. They can try to transplant a similar model, because it's a proof of concept here in the United States, which is probably more easily transplantable than a model from, say, Portugal, to take a country out of the air. And if it doesn't work, if there are negative consequences, then states can avoid these types of laws. And as I've said before, that's what our system of federalism was designed to encourage.
So, one question about that. There's the argument made earlier that, and of course, we're aware within the states, but aren't there different kind of cultures within some states? Because something that may be enacted in Midwest won't fly in Oregon. So even then, how can we transfer that a policy that works in one area will still work in another area within the United States? Wouldn't that be kind of the same problem as saying because it worked in Portugal doesn't mean it'll work within the United States?
It is a similar problem, but one of my primary rules of politics is that magnitude matters. And I personally believe that even though you are very correct, the cultures across the states vary significantly, and that's another one of the reasons that we have our federal system, because one-size-fits-all policies are rarely perfect here in the United States. I do believe that a law that works well in some place like Oregon is much more likely to be transplantable across the United States than a law that works across the Atlantic Ocean in Portugal. I believe that even though there is significant variation, I believe there's less variation between the states than there would be individual states between foreign countries. And so it's a similar problem. These models would likely not be directly transplantable. They wouldn't be the exact same models. They wouldn't be as effective in every single state as they are in others. But I do think having a proof of concept in an individual American state is a more compelling argument than a proof of concept in a foreign country.
I was going to ask, do you have any questions, Russ?
I mean, sure. I'll ask statements. Yes, I have a lot of statements. I don't know if I'm a very inquisitive individual. But with the case of comparing states rather than comparing countries, yes, this would be the ideal. The problem is no other state has decriminalized drugs since Oregon, so they have nothing to compare themselves to. And the problem with saying one state should do it, then another state should do it, then it'll be a domino effect, is that that's a very, very slow domino effect. One of the main reasons Oregon is doing this is because their prisons are completely overpopulated. America has the highest incarceration rate of any nation in the world. Any nation. That's absurd when you think about it. We're supposed to be the richest nation in the world. Also, we have 2.3 million people in prison, in which the Federal Bureau of Prisons reported that just in October of 2020, I guess I have a question. Guess how many offenses are drug related? Like, how many offenses are drug related? What percentage of offenses are drug related?
I guess I will have to wait with bated breath for you to tell me.
I'm gonna say 40%, and John, you're gonna say higher or lower.
I'm going to go with lower with a low degree of confidence.
I mean, yeah, you're both pretty close. It's 46.2% of all offenses were drug related charges. That's almost half of all criminal charges are drug related.
Okay, so the question there is, what defines drug related? Is it because we're differentiating between possession versus what if somebody's trafficking drugs? Is there a differentiation between there,
it's
or is it all just lumped in?
It's mostly trafficking, and a reason here's the problem with that is because, of course, John will probably know this more than I will. But if you're a prosecutor, you will likely charge somebody with trafficking, even if you may not have proof that they are distributing to a different individual. Even if you have a large amount of possession, the prosecutor can still charge you with trafficking, even if there's no evidence of you passing it off to a different individual, just to get the maximum amount of time for that person so they take a plea deal, if this makes sense.
So I was going to say, to that end, wouldn't the decriminalization not apply if you're charging people with trafficking where they would have the numbers above these small amounts of grams? Because this law is only applying to a few grams or less. So we're talking users here. We're talking people who have it within, small amounts. So I guess one criticism off of that would be it would impact the numbers, but how severe would this impact be if people are being charged with things like that?
It would depend on how obviously the substances are moved. Obviously, drug traffickers would just carry less on them that are in administrative violations. Like they would carry less drugs on them, so they wouldn't get a lot of jail time while they're trafficking. Basically, that'd be the main difference. But in all honesty, if you think about how much money spent on the DEA, if the DEA was if the Drug Enforcement Agency was changed to the Addictive Rehabilitation Agency, imagine how better this country would be. Now, I love Hank Schrader from Breaking Bad. I love all of them. You got to realize that it's not successful. We need a change unless you want to keep repeating what we've been doing for the past 50 years. And while we can wait for the slow process of federalism, meanwhile, there's millions of people losing their lives in jail from getting a felony. It's just, when are we going to realize we need a change?
I simply wish to make a singular point, and it was one that Roussel brought up twice. Roussel talked about how federalism is a slow process, and this is a pressing issue that needs an immediate fix. I agree that this is a pressing issue. I agree that we need to rethink the way that we enforce drug laws. We need to rethink the way that we write them in order to better pursue the policy goals with which we desire for the country to move towards. That being said, I think it would be very, very irresponsible of us to believe that this is the first pressing issue this country has faced, which requires us to do away with the confederalism that we have built with jurisprudence and policy over the last almost 3 centuries. Because federalism is what enables us to make good, deliberative policy. And if we are going to solve this crisis, that is what we need. Good, deliberative policy that targets the issues in a manner that is successful. I agree that many of the ways that we have targeted it before have proven unsuccessful, but we do not replace bad legislation and bad initiatives with poorly thought out, impulsive initiatives. And so I believe in the concept of federalism insofar that we allow particular states to be laboratories of innovation, of new models, of important new and creative ways of thinking that may be utilized by other states, rather than doing away with that process and attempting to transplant a model from a foreign country or even contrive our own in ways that have yet to show a definitive proof of positive concept.
Do you have a response or a question for that, Russ?
Matthew, I want to hear your perspective on this issue because I've heard you say your views are more similar to classical liberal, and how a classical liberal will view this issue is that the state should not interfere in matters like this, which is more based on individual liberty. The person is just harming themselves in matters of possession. So what do you think about drug criminalization laws in the first place?
I believe that drug criminalization laws do have a bit of weight to them. Of course, going into the medical field, I feel a bit differently. I may deviate a little bit, but to counteract your point on how it's just individuals hurting themselves, there are externalities from this.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody were to be using drugs, let's say I were to have a sibling that were to do so, and they were to get addicted, and they were to have hard financial times. Of course, they may, steal or, ask for money or cause some sort of problem to other people. So there's, external factors to this issue. It's not, the simple argument people may have with gun possession where they'll say, oh, I've got a rifle and I just shoot it on my property. I'm not harming anyone. This actually has some repercussions. So I believe that there needs to be something in play to prevent usage, though I am more in the sense of people seeking medical help than prison time. I believe it needs to be something more akin to decriminalization or more of a medically oriented. So I would, of course, like to see increased spending for social services, maybe something akin to, I hate to say it because I know it brings a negative stigma, but kind of like an institutionalization that's not as harsh, so people rehabilitate and they can get off of that instead of sending someone to prison for the rest of their life for a mistake. And that's kind of a problem that may come up because people can drop out of rehabilitation programs. So there needs to be some sort of sting to it. So maybe something that keeps them in there so they have to go through it instead of something as easy as decriminalization and then they get left back out or they just pay a simple penalty. Something to stop the drug use, essentially.
Okay, see, I definitely agree with the point you can harm other people, and that's one of many reasons I would say that it shouldn't be fully decriminalized, but still most of the harm is to the individual, like with smoking, even with secondhand smoke. Let's be honest, whose lungs are getting tarred up? It's the smoker. Now, while you're driving, you have less inhibitions when you're drinking alcohol, it still mostly affects the individual. And I do not believe, in this case, I really do not believe the state should be overstepping its hand in filling up its prisons with people it cannot even maintain. I mean, if we just allowed in Oregon, say, we'll have a very similar situation to tobacco smuggling, in which cigarette taxes vary by state, right? Well, a lot of tobacco smugglers will do is buy cigarettes at basically a low tax rate and then sell them for a higher price in a different state. We can see a similar thing happen if Oregon's the only state with decriminalization. We could see basically drug traffickers moving to Oregon just to make a ton of money with less risk. I mean, people forget tobacco's a drug, alcohol is a drug. This legislation is going to affect it similarly to how it affected tobacco. So that's another reason why I feel like going slow. I mean, there is no alternative. It's simple. Criminalizing people for 5 years of mandatory minimums for small possession of drugs is kind of barbaric in a sense. We found it hasn't worked, and the American people are in all honesty fed up with it. I almost bet you if you do a massive nationwide referendum, you would definitely have 50 to 60% of people vote yes if it was to decriminalize all drugs. Almost certainly.
John, do you have a response to that? Because if not, I have a question for you.
Please, Matthew, give me your question, and I can respond to both if I can, or I can respond to only one.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier that federalism needs to be in place and people need to have the ability to choose, correct? So you don't want something that happens in one state to be imposed on to the others. Well, if you value the rights of states to do that, wouldn't that be kind of destroyed in a sense if the federal government were to be blue and they were to pass decriminalization at a national level? Wouldn't some of these states oppose it? Wouldn't they have a problem with that? Wouldn't this kind of turn your argument topsy-turvy in a sense?
So I do believe I can respond to both. So I'm going to start with Russell's point, and then I'm going to get to yours. So Russell's point, if I understood it correctly, he said that because other states will still have more traditional drug enforcement laws, then you're going to see Oregon's laws not be as effective because there's going to be externalities that will affect how well it can possibly be administrated. He also made several points that I think were reiterating that we do need change in the war on drugs. I agree with the second. I disagree with the first only because in the eventuality that drug decriminalization ends up being a horrible, horrible policy, for some reason it is just a death sentence here in the United States and it results in several negative consequences, it would be much better if Oregon suffers those consequences in isolation rather than trying to push some national mandate, trying to have all the surrounding states do it, and all of the states have to suffer. And I think that's where we come back to the proof of concept argument. If Oregon proves that it can work well, even to some degree, then perhaps other states will sign on, and that will only make it more effective down the line. Now, moving on to Matthew's point, what's important to remember is in the federal system, there are federal laws and there are state laws. So let's take the legalization of marijuana, for example. In Colorado, you may still be stopped by a federal agent and arrested under federal marijuana laws. That can still happen. But because the state laws say that it's legal and authorities come after you, they can't come after you because it's legal there. Now, the federal government has taken a bit of a hands-off approach in many of the legalization states, especially under blue administrations. And if we got to a new blue administration that decriminalized drugs at a federal level, first of all, they would have to do that through Congress because right now, obviously, drug laws at the federal level are made by Congress. Enforcement procedures could be changed by the executive to some degree. Then all that would mean is federal agents would no longer be enforcing these laws because they would be decriminalized at the federal level. States would be more than free to continue to ban all of these drugs and to enforce as many drug laws as they so want, as many as they can legally pass under scrutiny from a court. And so it wouldn't destroy the point. All it would mean is the federal government has said in all of the federal agents across the country, they're not going to enforce old federal drug laws, but states would be free to continue to enforce those laws if they felt that those laws were still genuinely the best path forward for their state.
Do you have any final talking points or any?
No, I think I said the word change. I've said the word change. I've reached my quota of that word. So yes, you go ahead, Ben. Yes.
So one final thing I would say is I just go back to the argument that perhaps this is a good idea, perhaps not. I have my certain anxieties about how well this law is going to be administrated. The devil is, of course, going to be in the details for how effective this law is going to be. However, I am not going to tell the people of Oregon nor the representatives of those people that they can't do this, that they can't have democracy the way that they want it, because if they feel this is the best path forward for their state, I encourage them to try. And if it goes well, I would encourage other states to examine whether or not that's a good idea for them. And if it goes poorly, then I appreciate the fact that Oregon bit the bullet to some extent, and they showed the rest of the states that this is not something we want to pursue, and they've saved the rest of them, at least to some extent, from suffering through similar negative consequences. And I think that is a great and wonderful symptom and purpose of the federal system that we have here in the great United States of America.
Okay, so on a closing note, I guess we'll see in 2021 if Oregon just kind of falls and, perishes due to their new drug criminalization policy, or if it's a shining city on the hill for the rest of the country. So this has been today's episode of Policy War, and this is Matthew signing off.